Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me, a short information because the panel will take place in two languages. We have headsets and translation for those of you who do not understand either German or English. Yeah, thank you.
Alles klar, gut. Mhm. Ich bitte alle Gäste Platz zu nehmen. Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, sehr geehrte Teilnehmende auf dem Podium, ich freue mich, dass ich heute hier noch einmal stehen darf. Ich bin Gundula Bavendam und bin die Direktorin des Dokumentationszentrums Flucht, Vertreibung, Versöhnung. Ich begrüße Sie hier im Saal, aber auch im Livestream ganz herzlich zum öffentlichen Teil dieser Tagung, und zwar zu einer Podiumsdiskussion, die prominent besetzt ist unter dem Titel Russlands Krieg in der Ukraine zwischen Imperialismus und, in Klammern, selbst, Klammer zu, Zerstörung, Fragezeichen.
A panel discussion with very prominent participants. I give you the names of our panelists tonight.
Herr von Marschall, der die Moderation übernommen
Mr.
hat,
von Marschall will be our moderator, and he will then guide us through the debate. We have Irina Sherbakova here of Memorial. Welcome also to Marie-Louise Beck of the Center of Liberal Modernity in Berlin. Then we have Mr. Andrzej Nowak of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And Mr. Antoine Ajakovsky of the Collège des Bernardins in Paris. I would like to introduce Mr. von Marschall to you, who has agreed to be the moderator tonight. He's a journalist and since 1991 the editor of the Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel with its headquarters not far from here. We are virtual neighbors. I think it's not that frequent that a journalist is very active on the level of international politics with such a broad-based knowledge and experience in the years of the political turnaround at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. He worked for Süddeutsche Zeitung, and in that time he tended to look at Central Europe and develop genuine competence for the area. Then in the meantime, he has also developed a competence in United States matters. He's one of the few journalists who has lots of keys, secret keys to the White House, knowing many more things of that than many others. I would like to know more of that, Mr. von Marschall. He also won several prizes, the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, for example, prizes for his journalistic work. And he is the kind of person where we could hardly imagine to find a more competent one for tonight. Thank you for being able to come here, and I would like to give you the floor now. Thank you, Mrs. Barendam, for the friendly words introducing me. And the topic is very close to my heart, I must say, because I have studied Eastern European history and then focused on Polish and Galician history in the 19th century. And in the mid-1980s, that is according to the old calendar, I spent a year and a half in Krakow at the Jagiellonian University to collect material for my thesis. And part of that is that the city where you should have studied the history of Galicia in Lviv, Lemberg, wherever, was close to international students because it was formerly out of area for us, and for people like me, there was no chance to go there. So the organizers of the conference selected a very interesting and exciting title. So I'm talking about the title of the conference, rather the title of the panel, The Politics of Memory as a Weapon, as a Political Weapon. That has something of a guided nature. Then the second part of the title is Perspectives on Russia's War Against Ukraine. Perspectives, particularly in the plural form, already contains the notion that there may be different perceptions, not just one interpretation, not just one truth. Perspectives depend on your point of view, from where a person looks at things. In our case, it could be memories, historical memory, the family history. So it could depend on your own history, which is something, your own biography, which is something very subjective, or perception of the national history of the country where you live. And it doesn't have to be the country where things happen. And many other factors. The attractive thing about tonight's panel is that we have 4 different perspectives here. Not necessarily different ones in the case of having different viewpoints with regard to the responsibility of the war and its moral assessment. As far as I can see, there is no one here on the panel, that would be in favor of the war, no one who has understanding for Putin's actions, but the 4 panelists here tonight live in different countries, and by that alone they have a different view of the war. Marie-Louise Beck lives in Berlin, Andrzej Nowak in Krakow, Antoine Ayakovsky in Paris, and Irina Sherbakova, even though she lives in Weimar today, is here because the many years she spent in Russia have left a stamp on her, and the different places of residence and experience give all of them a different approach to the issue. So this is what we plan to do and what your role will be, dear audience. First, we will have a panel discussion here on the podium, but before we close at 8 o'clock, we would like to involve you as well. So please raise your hands once I say the floor is open. Now, often I have had the experience in Germany that hands go up just before closing the whole thing, but I think you are not as shy as that. So our exchange here will start with a very brief round of questions, because we want to do justice to the topic of the panel. How will this war end? Will it end with the success of imperialism? And I would interpret imperialism as a Russian victory. Or will it end with self-destruction, which could also refer to Putin's regime, the regime that will be destroyed, and the war could end with the destruction of that regime. But it could be also something completely different. So you don't have to verify your opinion. We don't have a lot of time, so I would like to ask you to be as brief as possible so that we can open a lively debate. So it's more like a survey of opinions. Irina Sherbakova, could we start with you, please? You are a cultural scientist, co-founder of Memorial, the human rights organization that is now prohibited. You criticize Putin's worldview. What is your opinion how that war will end? Well, honestly speaking, and I was here all day attending the conference, honestly speaking, I think this is the most ungrateful thing you could do now, coming up with a vision of the future. But I'm an incorrigible optimist, and I refuse to believe or to think that Putin might win that war, because if that happens, it will be an absolute disaster, and it would affect not just Russia, it's already in the middle of it, it will affect us all, which is why I would not even think of the option of a Russian victory. I think we have been embroiled in that horrible war for a year now. The first few days of the war showed that it will be a tragic event. A year ago, the projections were even more gloomy, and despite all that, there is a reason to hope. Thank you. Andrzej Nowak, as a Pole, you are living in a neighboring country with war on the other side of the border. You work at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, you concentrate on the European history of the 19th and 20th century, and you have the Club Jagiellonski. I would say it's a national conservative club. You may correct that label, of course, if you don't like that. So you are close to a circle that also looks at German history and that of the European Union in a very critical manner. At the same time, you're against the idea to apply criminal law to falsifications of history. There are some who believe that one should do that. False statements about the Holocaust could be fought with the application of criminal law. You are against that idea. History needs to be dealt with differently, in your view. So what is your projection? What is your prognosis? How that war will end? Imperialism or self-destruction?
Thank you so much for the invitation and for this very important, maybe the most important question that could be, as Madame Szczerbakova confirmed, posed in the end of our first session or first day. My perspective is maybe not typically Polish, but I would say typically historic. If I look from historical point of view, I know for sure that every empire falls. So in the end of the day, there would be no imperial Russia. For sure, very soon, there will be no more Putin, because every man dies someday, and especially if you have 70, and you cannot expect to rule over such a difficult country as Russia for, I would say, the next few decades. So in the long run, I'm sure that this empire will fall, as everyone else. So one can say this is optimistic view. I would call this realistic view. But there is some pessimism in it as well, because what I know from history is that empires fall and new or other win or take over. So what I am afraid is that Putin can win in persuading, in projecting a kind of perception of international situation, that in order to avoid future evil empires, good empires should make a kind of collusion in order to organize the world. So I am rather confident that Russian imperialism is close to the end due to its meager resources. Of course, I'm saying about a few years, maybe even few decades, not about the next few weeks, of course. But what I am afraid is that Putin almost persuaded many people in America, some people in France, some people in Germany, that in order to avoid bad experiences in the future, we have to make an arrangement of big empires. So this imperial, I would say, frame of mind can survive Putin. And this is my less optimistic answer to your question.
Wir werden auf diesen Punkt ganz bestimmt nochmal zurückkommen.
We will definitely return to that point, because there might be other opinions about that, and particularly about what governments should do in order to find a way out of this war. Marie-Louise Beck, speaking from a geographic distance, Germany is a little further away from the front line than Poland. You used to study history to be a history teacher, but then you entered into a political career until 2017. You were a member of parliament for the Greens, but you were rather atypical deputy. In contrast to many in your party and the Red-Green coalition, you supported the democratic coalition in Europe very early, and you criticized the gas deals with Putin. How will the war end, in your view, with imperialism or self-destruction or something else? I don't know really. And all I can say is that the mood has been changing all the time. After the first few days were quite successful for the Ukrainian military in defending the country against that attack, that blitzkrieg, we often had very positive attributes for the Ukrainian military, its agility, the quick ideas with which they fought, and that the realization that the Russian army was not quite up to date as it had claimed and as the Russians themselves had believed. Then there was a relatively long phase where the German media wrote, well, Putin has already lost the war. This went hand in hand with a kind of hesitant attitude toward how to equip the Ukrainian army, not just in Germany, because there was no clarity from the start, clarity in that respect that we want Ukraine to win, and we ask Ukraine what it needs to win. There has always been the reverse attitude. We in the Western countries thought about what could be good for them, what could we give them. It was never the other way around. At the moment, we see that the situation in the East is getting more difficult. The decision to send heavy weaponry was made too late for a spring offensive. This is why I am just very worried. Worried not because I would believe that Putin would really win that war, but I have enough imagination of even more destructions, even more people forced to flee the country, and they and we have no idea when they will be able to come back. So the Ukrainian people could actually be dispersed all over the place. And then I keep clinging to good news, such as the British Secret Service, which, as a rule, spreads positive news also about the weakness of the Russian military. Even an event like today's, that Zelensky goes to London, meeting Scholz and Macron today, has led me to hope and to believe that essential key countries in the European Union understand that it's now the moment when everything is at stake, that they should give up their hesitancy. So a lot depends on us here in the West, right? To the extent we can speak of us.
Auch Sie sind Historiker.
Anton Ajakovsky, you are a historian as well, and you have spent some time as a diplomat. You live in Paris, but your family is from Russia and Ukraine. And you yourself have also worked in Ukraine in the service of the French government. You were head or vice director of the Institut Français in Ukraine, and you were educational attaché of the French embassy in Kiev. So against your background, let me ask you, what do you think will be the end of the war? How will it end?
As you say, I'm a historian. I am a trained historian. I agree with others that democracy are stronger than empire. This is the lesson of the 20th century. The model of sovereignty based on dignity, which is the Ukrainian model, is stronger than the model of sovereignty that the Russians have, which is a false political theology based on the empire. So the problem is when that will happen. And here I agree with what has been said, that everything depends on us. And it's not by chance that Zelensky is right now in Paris. He was in London, tomorrow probably in Brussels, because he understands that his strength is nothing without the support of the coalition of Rammstein, 50 democracies. And the problem is that in France in particular, there are lots of people who are driven by a kind of postmodern identity. The postmodern identity is close to the homo post-Sovieticus. It is the idea that there is no truth, there is only interpretations, and there is no justice. There is only the state of law understood as application of laws, but not connected with justice. You see, this is a postmodern way of thinking. In reality, Ukrainians are reminding us that there is a state of law only if there is justice, and there is order only if there is a truth. So this is why, for instance, at the Collège des Bernardins, I gathered some experts, including from the Memorial, the Russian, Nikita Petrov, certainly a good friend of you, but also from Ukraine, from the Mogyla Academy, many intellectuals from Europe. And on what we agreed is that we have a big responsibility in the West, which is to make an evolution with international law. The United Nations are not working. The Security Council is not working because of this veto right of the permanent members of the Security Council. We need to propose an evolution of the international law in order to make the United Nations Charter working to make peace, which means to propose to the nations to make an appeal if the utilization of the veto right is not fostering peace. That was what we proposed in this report 3 years ago. Everybody at that time considered that we were like poets, because who will change the international law, the United Nations Security Council? But today, we see that there is a big evolution, and President Macron last September came to the United Nations Assembly and said, when there is war crimes, then we need to suspend the utilization of veto rights by the Security Council. I am surprised that we don't speak every day about this proposal, because there is a chance that we can lose the United Nations. This is what Zelensky is telling to us. It's not working anymore. We need to change, so this is our responsibility.
Nach diesen ja auch emotional sehr starken Eingangsstatement bin ich jetzt versucht, kurz vom Skript abzuweichen.
After these very emotional statements, I'm tempted to ask the crowd, what's the opinion of the audience? 3 choices. Russia wins, the Ukraine wins, or something else, something third. Let's have a show of hands. Who believes here in the audience that Russia will win the war?
Ja, Hände hoch einfach, Hände hoch.
Just raise your hands. Nobody? Wow. Okay. Who believes that Ukraine will win the war? The question is not the right question. Yeah, well, we can come back to that in the discussion. Okay, and who thinks something third might happen, something completely different? Okay, that seems to be the majority. Thank you. Let's continue with the next perspective. We've already heard that perspectives might depend a little bit on how close we are to events, so national perspectives or attitudes might differ depending on how close you are to the war, and also the willingness to enter into compromise, for example. I'd like to delve into this a little more deeply, and that's going to be quite challenging because it's actually a question in 2 parts. Again, please be brief in your answers. What I'd like you to do is, could you please sketch briefly the attitude of your country to this war? And then afterwards, do you agree with that national attitude or perspective, or would you take a different view? Maybe Shcherbakova can make a start. What's Russia really think? Actually, no, let's start the other way around, just so that the objective of the question is clear. Mr. Aliakovsky, you said that many people in France are quite willing to compromise. They might think, let's bring this to an end. There's not that much debate about justice, possibly. Is that the attitude of France? And then perhaps you could tell us what your attitude is. Maybe 3 to 4 minutes, just so that we can stick to time.
Well, French people, there was a survey, 75% of the population support Ukraine and support giving arms, tanks, even planes to Ukraine, 75%.
Planes even.
Even planes. And 61% of the population is in favor to have Ukraine inside the European Union. So there was a big move this last year to support Ukraine. The problem, and I have a research seminar at the Collège des Bernardins which deals on this problem, is that the political elite is not at the same level of the movement of solidarity of the French nation towards Ukraine and the understanding that Ukrainians are fighting not only for themselves but also for us, for the Western Europe. Yes, it's true that Stefanchuk, the president of the Rada, who came last week, received the support from the Senate, from the National Assembly, but 25% of the members of the parliament didn't vote the resolution in order to support Ukraine and send arms. So 25%, it's a lot, you know, and the whole question is why? And today there was a paper in the journal Le Monde explaining it's because these last years, these last decades, we were seeing only Russia. 3 years ago, the President Macron was hosting Putin and saying the priority of his politics is a reset of relations with Russia. At that time, there was no Ukraine. So there is a long, long walk to do to change and to admit that Ukraine is now probably the shield of Europe. Ukraine is the biggest army in Europe. We were not used to think like that. We were thinking the biggest army is Russia. It's a nuclear army. But what we see on the ground, we see that no, the most important army today in Europe is Ukraine. Okay, they don't have the nuclear power, but who will use nuclear power today? So this is why I think the work to be done is to work with mentalities. It's not enough to win on the military level, because we have seen that this war is not a geopolitical war. It's a conflict of civilization. And so my viewpoint, this is where I have a difference with some of my colleagues in France, and this is why we work with researchers, is to say it's not enough to send the tanks and planes. We need to work on mentalities. There is a religious dimension in this war. Who deals with religions? When we see the position of Patriarch Kirill, it's like a kind of new jihadism, you see? Who deals with this? History. Who deals with, as we have done between French and German after the Second World War, it's the same kind of war. We wrote together a textbook in history of Europe. We should do the same and help Russians, Ukrainians, Eastern Europe to write a joint history.
Marie-Louise Beck, wie würden Sie die Stimmung in Deutschland
Marie-Louise Beck, how would you describe the feel, the attitudes, the public attitudes to this war in Germany, and do you share those perceived attitudes and dynamics in our society?
Es gibt in unserer Bevölkerung
Well, in our society, there's astonishingly high sympathies for Ukraine and the people in Ukraine, and for the struggle between David and Goliath. The fact that these sympathies exist is also reflected by the warm welcome that the many refugees have had here in Germany. And as long as Germany can hide in the anti-military niche, given that Germany had this anti-military niche for such a long time, there has been an astonishing process of learning that Germany has been able to accept that we cannot simply refuse to ever engage in another war. But hearing you talk about 25% of members of parliament, we know that in Germany we have about 12 or 14% of right-wing extremist voters that are pro-Russian, and that also on the other side of the spectrum, on the left-hand side of the extremists, there are some views that would see themselves more strongly aligned to Russia and against any US-American interests, side by side with Ukraine fighting against an imperialist colonial empire of Russia, a colonial power that attempts to keep its empire up with barbarian means. So we also, I would say, have the 25% in our population. But what we don't have is political leadership beyond a moral obligation. Political leadership that explains that it is also a war about our interests. The debates about the war is strongly about the ethical dimensions, about the brutality against the Ukrainian population. All that is very present in the debate. And, you know, there's a strong division between good and evil and perpetrators and victims. But the next step, you know, the next thought, that in the Baltic states, in Poland, that from 2014 onwards, the view was quite different. To make that next leap, you know, that we might be next if we don't stop this imperialist aggression in Ukraine, that thought is not debated enough. Unfortunately, it is not propagated enough by our politicians. There, the biggest credo is, let's not damage ourselves. I'm not going to say we're going to abstain, but we don't want to incur any damage whatsoever. But I don't believe that this line of argument will take us very far, because I also think that the line propagated by our Chancellor, that we are only then forced to act if another NATO country is attacked, that cannot be upheld, I believe, because I think we should be grateful to the Ukraine that they are playing this protective shield for us at the moment. And this is something that the Baltic states and Poland totally understand. If it's no longer them, we'll be next, if the empire still has the strength to be as aggressive as it has been. Andrzej Nowak, what's the attitude in Poland, and would you agree with the majority of Poles in their views, or would you have a diverging perspective from what you consider to be the Polish view?
Thank you. Actually, it seems to me important to stress that Vladimir Putin wages at least two wars. One on the ground, killing hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of civilians. But another one, the war of perceptions. Here in this room, he loses that war. But outside this room, I'm not so sure. And I'm not telling only about South America, Africa, and half of Asia, at least, where he wins, definitely, that war of perceptions. That is something we should take into consideration. But also within Europe, and also sometimes within some circles of Polish population, or rather Polish political leadership as well. But you asked us to show different perspectives. So I would say, vive la différence. It is completely different perspective from, I would say, mainstream media in Europe portray. They tended to portray so-called populist governments as natural allies or addressees of Putin's perception war, a kind of natural members of pro-Putin coalition. In Polish case, it was exactly vice versa. The contemporary opposition party deciding, due to probably two different reasons. One, civilizational. We entered the post-historical era, like many other societies in Europe. Also a part of Polish society shared that hope after 1991, let's say. With no wars, with a kind of post-historical, post-geopolitical world. And with that, there came a kind of, I would say, orientation towards German leadership in Europe. I mean, Chancellor Merkel leadership. And these two attitudes together led to, I would say, a very strange rapprochement with Putin after he uttered so famous, or rather infamous, Munich speech in 2007, and after he attacked Georgia, which as a war of perception was won by Putin, definitely, because he managed to portray Georgia as aggressor. Tiny Georgia attacked Russia. Many in Europe believed that. And Polish president at that time, Lech Kaczynski, uttered exactly the perspective which was used here, that Georgia is first, then it will be Ukraine, then there will be Baltic states, then Poland, and maybe other countries. He enumerated exactly these countries in 2008. And then came a new government in Poland, which shared, I would say, Chancellor Merkel vision. No, that's accidental. That shouldn't happen. We should go back to normal relationship with Russia. And what really stunned me was the moment when Vladimir Putin, as prime minister, was visited as a #1 visitor to 70th anniversary of the beginning of World War II. And he uttered absolutely scandalous, I would say, main, so to speak, address, saying that the beginning of the war in 1939 was quite natural because there were two victims of World War I, of unjust Versailles Treaty, Russia and Germany. So that's why they needed to reverse that results of World War I. And so he almost absolutely openly said that Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was a natural consequence of Versailles Treaty, of unjust Versailles Treaty. Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was just, Versailles Treaty was unjust. And what stunned me, not the utterance of Putin, because I knew about his views earlier, but the reaction of almost all Polish press following our prime minister at that time. It was saying, wonderful speech. Rapprochement, Polish-Russian rapprochement is going further. And it was so blatant lie in comparison with the words uttered by Putin. So those in opposition at that time took power in 2015. And it coincided with something that also changed a little bit European perspective, namely the perspective that after attacking Ukraine, some people in main countries of Europe decided maybe Putin is not that reliable partner. And this coincided with the change of government in Poland, and Poland took the role of a leader of anti-Putin, I would say, war of perceptions. So that changes exactly that perception that exists in Europe that populists in Poland are pro-Putin. And I would like to add just one more interesting observation. Please do read Putin's speeches and something that precedes them. For example, in January 2020, there was an interesting debate among historians of Russia preparing speeches for Putin, published in Russia and Global Affairs, with Alexei Miller, professor of Central European University in Vienna at that time, as the leading propagandist of Putin. And he said, the ideal perfect enemy for us is Central European countries that should be presented together with our partners in Brussels as anti-Semitic, fascist ethnocracies that are dangerous for postmodern, post-historical way of thinking that could be established only with the good relationship between this postmodern establishment and Russia. And other participants of that debate stressed our leadership, meaning Putin, should address not populists only, that's obvious, but besides there are leftists in Europe, especially in Southern Europe, Spanish, Portugal, Italy, there are plenty of our followers. So what I am saying that you should look for followers of Putin, not only among populists, because there are many populists that follow Putin, I absolutely agree with that. But this is much more complicated than this black and white, so to speak, screen on which you see bad guys following Putin and good guys being anti-Putin. This is much more complicated. Putin can lose war of perceptions only if we start to perceive reality and not our stereotypes.
Irina Scherbakowa, wie ist das in Russland?
Irina Scherbakowa, what about Russia? I think this is the key question. We have been talking about how the situation has developed in Russia, and I think we all know that Putin wouldn't have been able to start the war and wouldn't have been able to strengthen his dictatorship if he had failed to turn a civilized society, destroying it, and turn it into one united organism standing behind him. And I think the politics of memory, historic perceptions, so I think we should actually intensify our way of explaining things to people. What we are currently doing is that it's all in shatters. It's a war that is underpinned with historic, quasi-historic arguments. It is presented as a just war. It's as if it was a war fighting Nazism, fascism, and whatnot. And we also try to inject terms such as imperialism and colonialism into the debate, which have little to do with what Russia actually is today. It's not actually what Russia stands for. And we see that reflected in views of how Russian society sees that war. It's not, in the typical classical sense, an imperialist war. No. The main idea of the Russians through all these years, there was not anything like that in 1991, 1992. You will remember when the Soviet Union disintegrated, there was nothing there. And it happened without bloodshed, or nearly without bloodshed. Why? How could you have imagined that? It was because imperial and colonial thinking looked completely different. The Russian people was abused, was subjugated, was under repressions, just as all other peoples of the Soviet Union. Of course, this goes back to Stalin's era, where there was a lot of talk about Greater Russia and Russian nationalism. That was all there, but it doesn't change the fact that the Russians had to suffer during the time of forced collectivization in the Great Terror and the Great War, when they were expropriated as kulaks or whatever. So this is why we are not dealing here with the traditional imperial neo-colonial kind of regime. And with these resentments, with these feelings, it was easy to play around, to exploit that, as it started in the later 1990s. What we also forget when we talk about the 1990s is why Putin managed to achieve what he achieved. How did he manage to turn society into what we have before us today? This is a point where there's a lot of responsibility involved. All of us living and working in Russia have to accept responsibility for that. But I think, as it has turned out, there's an enormous degree of egotism that had developed in the mid-1990s among the so-called elites, or the up-and-coming part of society. Supposedly they were in favor of democracy and the market economy, but none of those had an idea or wanted to have an idea of what a democracy should be and what this unfinished effort to come to deal with the past. For a historian, that's difficult to put into words. But there are writers who do that excellently. There's one, Vladimir Sorokin, who wrote about that at the start of the 21st century. He wrote a Utopia, and you can read that and you get an idea of what Russia will become in the future. So he was very forceful in saying that this corpse of the past, this stinking corpse of the past with everything that it entails, all the imperial and other features, it was on the way in the 1990s, but somehow or other it was covered with all sorts of trash, but nobody really cared about removing it. And the very fact that this stinking past was not removed is part of what we have today. Now it is needed again, and it suddenly became alive again, such as a zombie, a Frankenstein. And I think the letter Z is not there by accident. It is a situation where you sometimes find yourselves in the middle of strange symbols that kind of remind you of something that has little to do with that. In that war now we see many absurd symbolic pictures. So this zombie is gaining some degree of control of us. but not immediately. It was a slow process. If it had happened overnight, many people would have understood what is going on, but it was a slow process, and it was all gradually happening. It was a little more, a little stronger, a little more bloodshed back in the 1990s. And the first movement of that corps started when the war in Chechnya broke out. That was in December 1994. Now, when we know about Bucha and the horrors in other places, this is something that has happened before on a smaller level and to a smaller degree. So the corpse sprang to life. And this corpse of the past was the dead body of the state. You had the feeling that it will soon be destroyed. It's nearly dead already, but in reality, it was not dead at all. And gradually, it became alive again. Putin managed, by the way, the war in Chechnya brought him to power, and he managed to apply the Frankenstein monster in other sections and to turn that into an aggressive, violent state, a state based on a system that corrupts people over a period of 20 years or so. People got used to violence, people got used to what the state wanted from them, and they adjusted. This was the foundation of it all. Getting adjusted, feeling a sense of belonging to that state. So all that made it possible for people who wanted to resist that to be completely marginalized. So what we see is that different means were applied, involving the people, sowing distrust and anxiety, applying violence, and this is where we are now. People have left the country if they were too afraid of it all, but well, 1 million after 1917, that's quite a large number, if that's the domestic emigration. There's a lot of resistance in the country, but it's too little to achieve anything. It's too little to oppose the system. Well, Faulkner said the past is not over, it's not even dead. So the claims to power, everything continues to be alive. All three of the panelists wanted to respond to that. Do that if you want to comment on what Irina said, but would you please wait for a second for my last point that I wanted to address here? The question is, what does the war change about our own images of history and our ideas of geography in Europe? Do we now have a different look on Ukrainian history in Germany, France, Poland, and elsewhere? Do we see our own role in that differently? Has Ukraine existed in the imaginative map? Or is it only there? Has it not been put on that map now? And before that, the Ukrainians were not seen as subjects of history. In Germany, well, our own past is suddenly coming back. The way the Russians think about the space between the Germans and the Russians is exactly the way we thought. It's not that long ago that many in Germany said, well, the fate of the peoples living between the Germans and the Russians, they are unable to govern themselves, and their fate is either to be governed by the Germans or the Russians, and you reach agreement above their heads who has influence where. Ukraine has a lot of myth building in the Polish history, in real life or in novels and films. Whatever I take, you see an image of Ukraine and its role and its relationship to Poland. So if you could perhaps try not to forget what you wanted to comment on Mrs. Scherbakova's ideas, but would you also include comments on what has this war changed in public perception or not changed, because a number of stereotypes continue to be strong. Mrs. Beck, you put your hand up first. So what did you want to ask Irina, and what has that war done in the consciousness of the Germans and how we see Ukraine in our own history? Well, Irina, we have been together for many years, and I know that for you the question has always been at the center that not only the victims but also the perpetrators must be mentioned. That's part of what Memorial stands for. However, the question is also about the responsibility of a nation, of a people. And even when we look at the Bolshevist area, the violent rule and the Red Terror and all that, isn't it true that starting in 1990, there has been a chance to become a subject of history? I think this is an important point when you say imperialism and colonialism is not really applicable as terms to describe the process. And then you describe a subjugated, a traumatized nation where it's not really clear how much obligation it is willing to take on for itself. It's a very complicated question, I believe. Well, as far as we are concerned, I think we need to clean up. Clean up in our own political self-perception as Germany and the European Union. The European Union cannot say, as it did in 2014, Putin is standing completely outside the European consensus because he returns to the geopolitical positions of the 19th century. I remember the debates in the German Bundestag. Well, returning to this 19th century's thinking, that's inappropriate. Well, no. It's a very cold-hearted way to display power politics, very imperial, really. And slowly, the European Union starts to understand that it needs to think in geostrategic terms. This, I think, will have to be one aspect when you think about how to make Ukraine part of the European Union. It was a political issue with regard to Bulgaria and Romania, and will be an even more intense political debate in case of Ukraine. We have to clean up our own myths in Germany, that peace in Europe can only be achieved together with Russia, not against Russia, that our prosperity is inseparably linked to good trade relations with Russia, gas, oil, and the high level of dependency. Well, we have to learn that deterrence, delineation, and protection of the borders can maintain peace. And equidistance is not the order of the day. We can't have equidistance to Russia and the United States. The transatlantic relations may occasionally be difficult. Nevertheless, our partner is the United States, and it has to be our partner when we talk about the free world, which is at stake and which we hopefully can maintain. Andrzej Nowak, your comment on IRENA and your own ideas about what has changed with regard to the Polish understanding of history or not. So what kind of stereotypes are still there and what is changing?
Thank you so much. So I'll begin with answering your question, because it seems a good starting point to my commentary to Irena's interesting or provocative statement. Actually, it seems to me that Polish historical imagination concerning Ukraine didn't change that dramatically after the very hot war began the last year. Why? Because Ukraine was part of our common history, or Poland was a part of common Ukrainian history, as you will. At least from the late 14th century, and at least for 4 centuries, which is long enough to make our history really entangled, and we through many works of art, of literature, musical aspects of our culture, became very aware of the fact that there exists something else called Rus than Moscow. We began to differentiate between the two, at least from the beginning of 16th century, something which is very difficult to make understand to our Western partners from any country. Difference between Rus and Россия. Sometimes we call it Rutenia with old Latin name. But usually in the West, Rus, Rutenia, Russia, it is the same. No, not for us. So that makes our understanding that Ukraine is something else than Russia quite natural, nothing new, I would say. What changed that war was receding, but not evaporating completely, memory of our, I would say, national clashes or ethnic cleanses done by Ukrainian extreme nationalists during World War II. It exists as part of our memory, 100,000 Polish people killed, as exists something which could be called history of Ukrainian people exploitation by Polish landlords in Ukrainian memory. So there are conflicting issues in history that exist but are much less important in contemporary, I would say, historical consciousness than they used to be some even years ago. It is interesting to present the results of a recent poll in Ukraine. 1% of Ukrainians, 1% said that Poland could be perceived as enemy. 90% said or answered that Poland is the most friendly nation to Ukraine, which is relatively new phenomenon, that result, that extreme result, because this is extreme. And in Poland, I don't know about any similar poll, so I cannot quote any results, but I am almost sure, persuaded, that most of Poles sympathize with Ukraine, much more than 75%, which were mentioned in France or in Germany. So that means that Ukraine existed on our historical radar far before the last year. And that comes, or with that, I will come to my commentary to the question of Russian imperialism, real or not, in contemporary Russia. I would say that according to some historians like Jeffrey Hosking, there was a big hope in the beginning of the 90s that nation builders in Russia would win the war against empire savers within Russia. But they lost but they lost in the 90s completely. Longing for empire was the real source of Putin's, one of real sources of Putin's victory. It doesn't mean that Russian people, ordinary people, wanted to dominate over, I would say, Ukraine, but they wanted to go to the Black Sea as their natural holiday. They wanted to go to Riga for their favorite drink, Rижский balsam. That is typical imperial way of thinking, that Riga should be open to us, should belong to us, as much as Yalta, as much as Simferopol, as much as Odessa. This is imperial. You shouldn't ask about whether this is imperial Moscow citizens, but you should ask Ukrainian citizens, Latvian citizens, or Lithuanian or Moldovan. The answer of Russians is not valid here, I'm sorry. But what is even more important is the shortened perspective on history. It was exactly the same perspective that was uttered by, Deputy Mayor of St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin, when he was asked by Kerber Foundation in March 1994 to present his views in so-called Bergedorfer Gesprächekreis, to present his views on the future of Russia. And he said, we were as persecuted as any other nation during the Soviet times, and this is absolutely unjust. He simply, or you rather, repeated his words almost verbatim.
May I interrupt you 2 seconds? Die Technik, irgendwas kracht hier in die Mikrofone. Das muss daran liegen, dass irgendjemand das Mikrofon...
Sorry, just interrupting very briefly. The microphone sound is not great. Can you help us, please?
Am I audible?
Technicians? Can you hear me okay?
I will finish, sorry, quickly. But what I wanted to say is not to criticize you by replicating the formula used by Vladimir Putin, relatively young politician, deputy of Sobchak, almost 30 years back. What I'm saying that this is wrong perspective to say that the beginning of the problem of Russian imperialism, false accusation of that Russian imperialism, are connected with Soviet times. No, it's much older history. It's 19th century way of thinking. That was exactly mentioned here by my predecessor as the source of contemporary problems. The thought that there are big nations that have right to decide for others. And actually these others around, these weaker neighbors, have no say. They are future Russians if they are not Russians yet. And this is how Putin presents this war as a national war, not imperial war. By no means. He would never say that this is imperial war. And most of Russians would answer, this is not imperial war. We defend our nationality, which is endangered in Ukraine, as it could be endangered in Lithuania or in Belarus or wherever else in the Soviet Union. As Putin
It
said
is
in
fascinating. It is really fascinating, without any irony. But I have to look at the.
Okay, so this is the end. Remember pre-Soviet times, and remember imperial history that is much deeper in Russian culture as well. Pushkin was mentioned here. Read his verses. They are so immersed in extreme imperialism. Read Brodsky, whom I met in Krakow and whom I admired as much as I admire Pushkin. He is so imperialist in his thinking. Read his extreme poem on Ukraine independence. It's so chauvinistic that it could be published in Völkischer Beobachter some decades before. And he was the most beloved liberal poet of Russia. Sorry.
Antoine, you have the bad luck that you are the last in the row, and I have to start with the comment on time, conciseness.
Well, I'd like to say 2 or 3 things,
yes,
because it is important issues and it's difficult. I will take 3-4 minutes.
That's fine.
First of all, I would like to remind you in 1981, Greece wanted to be part of the European Union, and lots of politicians were against, saying Greece is not ready. But President Mitterrand said, we cannot ask Plato to wait. You see? And we invited Greece. Today, we cannot say the same for Ukraine. We cannot say, we cannot wait Skovoroda. We cannot ask Skovoroda to wait because nobody knows who is Skovoroda, who is the main Ukrainian philosopher. He is a great man, but nobody knows him. So, answering to your question, I would like to say, first of all, we need to heal the wounds of the past. There will be no knowledge. There will be no history, European history, including Ukraine, including the history of imperialistic thought in Russia. There will be no history if we will not go out from our amnesia, our postmodern approach. And to heal the wounds of the past, we need a judgment of communism. This is the urgency. There was a judgment of National Socialism in Nuremberg. We need a judgment of communism. Can you imagine that Holodomor, which is the great famine of 32-33, it's 5 million people who died. It means 20,000 people every day during 6 months died. 20,000 people every day during 6 months. And it was not judged. And a crime that is not judged is a crime that is justified. And a crime that is justified is a crime that is repeated. And there is just one letter between Holodomor and Golodomor, you know, the death through starvation and the death through the freezing. This is what's happening this year. So my first point is to say we need urgently to work together with historians from the whole Europe on this judgment of communism. Then there is an initiative coming from different platforms, ENRS, but also the platform on memory, of European memory and conscience, to build a memorial in Brussels dedicated to the victims of totalitarianism in the 20th century. Why there is no memorial of the victims of the totalitarianism in Brussels, both of Nazism and communism? You see, communism, for Stéphane Courtois, the Black Book of Communism, it's 100 million people who died in the 20th century. So we need to do this history. Without this, there will be nothing. There will be no European Union. There will be no possibility to integrate Ukraine. When we will do this, then we will discover who is Skovoroda. We will discover Democrats in Russia who fought against the empire. Then we will be able to see today Russian Democrats. The problem is that we do not see the Russian Democrats. We are happy to have memorial, but we do not see I brought with me the Russian Action Committee. This is friends of Khodorkovsky, of Kasparov, some of the friends of Navalny. They created an anti-war Russian committee. There are lots of projects. They all agree on the fact that Ukraine should rediscover its borders of 91 and so on. But we don't see them because we only see the Russian imperialism. And it's because it was not healed, and there was nobody who asked, there was no forgiveness, you see? So this is the way we should go to do this historical work, this social work with this memorial, and then to work with the Russian democratic opposition in order to build a real democracy in Russia, because there will be never peace in Eastern Europe if there will be no democracy in Russia. This is, you know, we need to face this reality. Tanks and planes will not be enough. There will be always a resentment and a new Putin, a new Prigozhin, a new Kadyrov who will come back. If this illness, we will not be healed.
Nur ich muss doch zwei Sätze sagen.
Mein Mikro aus. Sofort.
Just a
Irina,
moment,
ich muss
Irina.
jetzt zwei Damen um
I
Hilfe bitten.
now have to
Das
ask
eine
two
ist Frau
ladies to
Babendam,
help me.
die
One is Mrs. Bardendam, of whom I should ask permission to give me another 15 minutes. You nod your head. Thank you. Because we want to have a debate with you. And the second is that Irina Sherbakova should have a chance to reply. So should we first ask the audience and then let you speak, or I would like to say something within just 3 to 4 minutes. Don't worry. I don't think I spoke very long, really. And perhaps this was why there were misunderstandings. I didn't say that those responsible should not be brought to account. On the contrary, that is what I wanted to say when I quoted that corpse. How do you deal with it? Because this is exactly what responsibility is all about. You can't take a broom. You need a more strenger mechanism. You need commissions. You need historians. That's what Memorial has said all these decades, but it never really happened. It was done half-heartedly only, or with a degree of populism. You know how the state dealt with history. Lenin is still buried in the mausoleum, and St. Petersburg is situated in the Leningradsky Oblast, this eternal thing about half-hearted decisions that we know from the 1990s, and nobody seems to care what the system actually did, and we don't even have a name for what it did. Stalinism, communism, or whatever it was. And no explanation that would make sense to the people. What exactly was it you lived through? And why did it happen? And what do we have to learn from its disintegration? In reality, there has never been an explanation for the people as to why the Soviet Union, a real colossus, disintegrated in no time, and no one really thought about it. So this is why this great opportunity was missed. And conversely, in order to cement one's position in power, the resentment that was there. I don't have to talk about that in Germany. There's GDR nostalgia here as well. But when you don't have a democracy, then if you don't have a place where you can talk about these feelings, you can imagine what happens. I think that must be said. I would say that it doesn't even play a role whether you wanted to go to the Black Sea or whether you wanted to go to the Baltic states. And going on holiday actually was something for a very small group of people only. Well, the Black Sea was perhaps the past of relatively many Soviet people, but they had grown older, and I think that was not the crucial element. And don't forget, there is not a single big family in Russia which doesn't have relations with Ukraine, doesn't have roots in this or that way. In that sense, the war is even more horrible, more immoral for many people. I would actually say that the exit from the disaster will be difficult, complex for Russia than you can now imagine. But when you believe all lies, it's not going to help. A few words on arts and culture. I think it is overestimated, and this is ahistoric to have a debate on that now, whether it's Dostoevsky or to turn that into a joke, Dostoevsky or Pushkin are not responsible of Russia's imperial thinking. Society that has developed in the wake of Putin's power, for this society, arts and culture don't play a role at all. Not even for scientists. They don't see history as part of the humanities or the sciences. So there's no respect for such findings. They managed to destroy that. And that's one reason why propaganda has such an enormous influence. But do you really think that the people who support Pushkin read Dostoevsky, or that Pushkin played a role for them over the past 20 years? It was brushed aside as if it wasn't there at all. And only a very small part of the people still remember that. This is the tragic element in it. I think it's now overestimated because we are trying to find reasons, explanations of what happened to people, of why they are what they are. I think it's not arts and culture, but it's fear, the idea to have to adjust, to come to grips with the violence, the loss of values. All that's left is a drive to consume. All that's left. It's not Pushkin, it's not Dostoevsky. So now I will fulfill my promise that the audience will come in. Please raise your hands. We have someone with a microphone. And since we take exchange very seriously, 3 requests. Give us your name, be brief as possible, so that many can have their say, and tell us who your question is addressed to. Who will hand around the microphones? All right. Just hand them out, and then we'll listen to what is said. Addressed to Mrs. Shabakova. I listened to you with great interest. And I think you very... Would you please tell us your name? Wilfried Peipsch. I'm an eternally curious person. There are different films that you can see only rarely here in Berlin on the status of the law. It's Leviathan, on the psychological status of the new middle classes, it's Loveless. On the question of the destruction of the Russian soldiers in Afghanistan, it's, I forgot the title, and strangely enough, the best comedy of how to deal with Stalin is Stalin's death. But this comedy was not filmed by Russians because, just as Martin Hamish said, this was nothing the Russians wanted to do. So even nowadays we see new memorials to Stalin going up all the time. Yes, imperialism is something that sounds very old-fashioned. Perhaps we should go back to that when we discuss the age of the empire and imperialism. I don't think the term is correct. You are right to point out that the Soviet Union has imploded in 1991. And as a result, the big empire disintegrated. What came after were 10 years where the Putin camarilla continued just what is exemplified in Stalin's quote, "Death solves all problems, no man, no problem." This is what they did in Chechnya. You should now formulate your question. I would like to know what you think about the self-destruction, the second part of our title here. What would you want to say on that? Not in the economic sense, but in a mental, psychological sense. Thank you. Next hand up. Alena Utica, political contributor. Mrs. Sherbakova, perhaps also to the other panelists. I wonder whether it was just Putin who started to collect Russian earth when he waged the war against Chechnya, but it was in Baku and in the Baltic states under Gorbachev, when all the separatist explosives went up at the fringes of the Soviet Union still in existence then, and whether Yeltsin, when forting Moldova, was actually another starting point.
Olszowski, mein Name.
Okay, my name's Olszowski. I have two comments and questions also to Irina Sherbakova. It concerns the attitudes of the Russian intellectual elites to the small kind of neighboring country of Ukraine. There's two statements that are doubtful. Solzhenitsyn, the Nobel Prize laureate, declares that there's no Ukrainian language. He says that's an invention of the Austrians dating back to Galician times, full stop. You can imagine what the reaction of Ukrainian intellectuals is. Brodsky, Nobel Prize laureate, writes a poem celebrating celebrating, inverted commas, the independence of Ukraine, which is full of terrible statements. It was published posthumously, and then it was actually it was published at the right time and was used for propaganda. I wanted to point out the fact that the Russian intellectuals also are not solely responsible for the mood that is being created. I mean, Solzhenitsyn talks about human tragedies. For him, the Ukrainians are brothers, no question, but political independence is not something he's willing to accord to Ukraine. Okay, let's collect some more questions. My name is Björn Riemer. I have a question to Mr. Nowak. I'm married to a Polish lady. She's from Warsaw. Therefore, I'm really interested in the German-Polish relations. Unfortunately, that relationship has suffered quite a lot ever since the PiS government has come to power. What's your view? How can Germans and Polish governments come to more cooperation? How can we come closer to one another? Because Putin's intention is clearly to split Europe and to break it apart. Okay, thank you. Let's have some more questions. Yes, my name is Klaus-Dieter Stönke. I'm a lawyer. The panel positioned itself right at the beginning to say that there's no one kind of, supporting Putin in the audience or supporting the Russian aggression, which of course is quite right. But Marie-Louise Beck, I'd like to ask you, you represent a party that used to be very strongly pacifist. If I now think of the Green Party's positions, who talk about delivering weapons or sending weapons to Ukraine, that makes me question what's the position of the Green Party now. And I want to ask Mrs. Beck, do you see a connection between the Russian politics that has led to a war of aggression on Ukraine and Western policies, including Germany and NATO? Do you see a connection? I have in mind the speech by Putin in the German Bundestag, where he spoke in German, actually, and made offers to the West to cooperate economically, to establish connections to NATO. And Ms. Merkel sat there with a stony face, and that was the response of the West. And that then led to a change in Russian politics. May I answer? Yeah. No, it's absolutely fine. You know, it's, of course, it's legitimate to ask that question. Okay, yep.
And I will have a very short question to Ms. Sherbakova. I thank you for your speech. I wanted to ask if we are considering, and I really love that idea that the imperialism as a concept is not very fitting to understand what really happens. If we are looking on imperialism, aren't we trapping ourselves within European concept of empire of 19th century instead of Oriental imperialism, like empire or Grand Duchy, which was built by Ivan IV, or even the Golden Horde as a case study? So probably just a reference to Lev Gumilev's idea what Russia might be or what Russian Empire is as anti-European, not European concept, even of empire. So this 19th century imperialism and colonialism might be failing probably just because of that.
Ja, wir hatten so viele Hände. Es gibt auch sicher noch eine Frage.
Okay, we had loads of hands. That is your last chance. Any more questions from the audience? No? Okay, I think most of the questions addressed Irina Sherbakova. We had one directly addressing Ms. Beck, which was about the Green Party's pacifism and what's the contribution of NATO to the war. And then we had a question concerning German-Polish relations. Can that relationship be strengthened in order to, counter Putin more effectively? And then there was a question addressed to all of us. This is a question from the chat. The question is, do we need a European history book? Do we need European history education modeled on the German-French or German-Polish history book? Okay, Ms. Sherbakova, would you like to make a start and then we carry on? Okay, I'll try to be brief. I'll be nice again at the end. I just need to be strict now. Okay, well, self-destruction is already happening. We've been talking about this all along. Actually, though, I wouldn't say self-destruction, because what was destroyed in Russia isn't actually self-destruction. I don't know whether I can phrase this properly, but it's really the destruction of everything to do with everything intellectual, morals, science even. I would say also empathy, empathy for other people. But this is in fact a global destruction we are witnessing, and that, of course, is a disaster that we are faced with. I say we because, well, I was born in that country and my whole life was there, so that is why I still say we. So yes, incredible destruction has gone on therein, and in that black hole of destruction, Ukraine is now being sucked into physically, and terribly destroyed and whatever else might be in the future. I'm not entirely sure. Someone mentioned the nuclear weapons earlier, but yeah, the question of nuclear weapons, to my mind, is, well, I suppose for me it's an illusionary question. And to me, the situation is not very clear. And the threats that were made a few days ago in Volgograd, you need to take those seriously, I think. I don't know what future decisions might be taken. I do think we need to be ready to think the worst, including more destruction. The question was, did it start much earlier? Well, I didn't mention Chechnya for nothing. Yes, of course. All along the edges, attempts were made, to somehow retain the system or to create little points of disquiet. But I would say that Gorbachev, well, in Vilnius, there were attempts to recreate the system. In Tbilisi, there were more attempts, but nonetheless, the feeling was that there wasn't any real conviction that it would survive. I'm talking about the Soviet Union now. Back then, maybe it was wrong. I mean, Chechnya, we took that very seriously, but with Gorbachev, yes, he wasn't willing to exert, to use violence. Of course, he wasn't always certain, and mistakes were made, but he wasn't willing to exert that much violence. Yeltsin was a different story. And I do think that in December 1994, that was the beginning, and that was what brought Putin to power. That was the beginning of this slow dissolution of Russian society. I'm convinced of that. The role of intellectuals, yes. You mentioned a few films. I would say that we've had years of free speech and freedom of opinion. Lots of films were created, lots of books were published, and still books are being published in Russia. People buy books, people read books. And that even includes books written by opposition forces. But censorship was introduced, everything's shrinking. Television, as you know, is completely state-dominated. So those little windows are becoming tinier and tinier. So that is something I can only confirm. And indeed, many people, cultural people have left Russia. And maybe this is not a great feature, but all the time propaganda is creating a certain hysteria. You know, why don't we create something patriotic about this war, something that really grabs people, something that really, you know, something that really becomes a national bestseller, something that really convinces people. And I actually think the fact that it doesn't yet exist is an indication that it's not going to work. It can't be created. No song, no poem, no film can really do this, can really convince people to that degree. Okay, you mentioned Brodsky. You're right. This is a poem that sounds awful, but there's good reasons why he didn't publish it in his lifetime. So that is part of the answer. I think that was everything, was it? Did I touch upon everything? Yes, I think so. Thank you. Marie-Louise Beck. Okay, green pacifism and missed opportunities. Well, the Green Party has never been a fully pacifist party. The non-violent pillar has always been inward-looking, non-violent in how we look at nuclear weapons, at nuclear power, setting us apart from what today we'd call a black bloc. Nuclear pacifism was widely propagated, was widespread. It centered around the Pershing missiles. The Green Party, at least, other than some other forces of the peace movement, mentioned SS-20 as a next stage on top of Pershing missiles, a next stage that would increase the threat to Europe. But yes, many of us were rather left-wing. That meant we were anti-NATO. The Green Party program very much supported the dissolution of NATO. And there was a very broad anti-transatlantic bloc. The name that's most well known in Berlin, Christian Ströbele, he actually collected weapons for El Salvador. He was never a pacifist. And he never changed his line. He was always left-wing, who thought that the Pax Americana was a bad thing for the world. So that's one of the myths that we need to deal with. But one thing that has stayed with us is a basic attitude that is not being reflected very thoroughly. And I have to also admit this for myself. We thought that the never again, as a historical consequence of the Nazi period, we thought that this would put us on the right side of history automatically, to just say never again. In 1994, we had to debate these questions in the context of Bosnia, the war in Bosnia. And there was a fantastic essay in the Süddeutsche Zeitung by Peter Schneider. He wrote, how come that the children of the perpetrators believe that pacifism is the only answer to the aggression of National Socialism? Because it ignores the fact that National Socialism was brought down by military means, by many states, including the Soviet Union. And our generation, as the post-war generation, we realized this for the first time when we were faced with disintegrating Yugoslavia. It wasn't just about the question of never again, which is too short-sighted, because the real answer is, what do we do if war, is brought to one country by another, if one state just engages another in war? And how much importance do we accord to the protection of the victims? Yeah. So this slogan of never again, okay, the most dramatic expression of which was never again Auschwitz, never again the Shoah, where for our time it should be translated into, yes, never again war, but also never again this feeling of being victims, never being without protection. And that's the purpose of the United Nations. And United Nations mandates are confirmation of the fact that military actions exist that are necessary. And this is exactly what we're experiencing now in Ukraine. And yeah, a large proportion of our society has learned that same lesson in a very short space of time.
Answer. The perspective of improving Polish-German relations seems to me very short. I mean, the elections that will come this autumn in Poland either will elect a contemporary opposition, which is considered here as pro-German or at least a good partner, but who followed wrong German policy of Chancellor Merkel, and for it is criticized by contemporary government of Poland. as much as German leadership under Chancellor Merkel was criticized and still is criticized by our contemporary government, which criticizes also politics of Olaf Scholz and is criticized by abusing judiciary system, different rights. Some of these accusations is based on more reliable facts, some of them on stereotypes that are simply disseminated by opposition, contemporary opposition, which is treated by not very objective journalists. I am not saying about one of the perfect journalists Germany has, who is with us here on this panel, but not everyone in Germany, and of course not everyone in Poland is as accurate. So many of German journalists simply take their picture of Poland from one source, and this is opposition. And sometimes it's not a very accurate mirror. So there is a part to be blamed on German side, as much as there is a part, maybe a big part, on contemporary government, which uses, I must say that, anti-German feelings in its political campaign. But this is a part of answer to an extreme behavior of German leadership in past, I would say, 10 years, which backed sometimes crossing borders of Polish democratic sovereignty, one party. This was a kind of imperial policy. When you almost, I would say, undermine democratic election verdict of a neighbor country. So there is blame on both parts, according to my perception, which might be, of course, subjective. But either opposition will win and the improvement will be automatic, or the current party will stay in power. And I am sure that this will make time to reflect on both sides. The German part that we have to live with democratic verdict of Polish population, which is not very fitting our so to speak, choices, or on Polish side, on the side of Polish government, the election is ended. We have to live with our powerful neighbor whose decisions concerning our, that is Polish and East Central situation, concerning Russian danger, which is there, are crucial. So we have to improve our relations with Germany, whatever would rule Warsaw after this October. I'm almost 100% optimistic in this respect. As regard other question which was posed to all of us and was not answered, where the name of Solzhenitsyn was used, it was not answered. It is interesting to say, to remind that Solzhenitsyn in his last interview by Die Welt was asked why he accepted a special honor from ex-colonel of KGB and declined the same honor from President Yeltsin. And the answer was short, because Yeltsin dismembered Russia, diminished Russia, and Putin gathers Russia back again. So there is something that I think Russian, I would say, part of population that will rebuild Russia. I'm sure that from the shambles, Russia would be rebuilt. But I hope the people that would acknowledge that it is not just, as you said, that culture is not responsible. Culture is responsible. Pushkin is responsible because it is being taught Russian children for the last 20 years as the, I would say, proof that Russian culture, even Pushkin, backs Putin. This is something which is taught by every school everywhere in Russia, and it is not without effect. So I hope that one day people like Georgy Fedotov, great Russian historian, emigre historian of church, who founded that particular penchant of Pushkin towards imperialism and condemned it by defending all the rest of Pushkin. This is my position. Pushkin, Dostoevsky have to stay with us. But Russians, not us Poles, who were so many times criticized by Pushkin or by Dostoevsky, but Russians should acknowledge there are some parts of Pushkin and of Brodsky and of Dostoevsky that should be at least erased from school curricula, I would say.
Das Schöne an solchen Diskussionen ist, dass man diese Meinung.
The great thing about these discussions is that you can leave those disagreements on their own, and everyone can think about that on the way home. Antoine Iamkowski, what about the question as to whether we need a European history book, or whether you would perhaps like to say something on the missed opportunity that the West could have prevented the war if it had behaved completely differently years ago?
To add something, we speak about Solzhenitsyn, imperialism. In front of Solzhenitsyn, there were also Russian authors like Voinovich. And Voinovich, he wrote a book, Moskva 2042, Moscow 2042, who was a very strong critique of Solzhenitsyn and of imperialism. So there are Russians like Fedotov, like Berdyaev, who are against the imperialists. And this current of Russian thought should be actualized. But to answer to your question, myself, I am of course convinced by the necessity of a textbook on European history. I published in several languages the History of European Consciousness, that's the Polish translation. There is the French one. I would like to have a German one, you see. We need to work together. We need to work together in order to make a new historiography, which is something which goes after amnesia, after postmodern historiography, which is our main history. This new approach is mosaic. A mosaic is when the professional historians, the trained historians, are giving the facts, are giving the framework, the chronology. And inside this chronology, each citizen brings his own stone from all over different colors, different countries. It's a new interactive history. It's a connected history. It's what we should do together. I spoke about that with many people, including in the European Parliament. But inside the European Parliament, nowadays, still it is the postmodern approach which is dominating. And it's a problem for me, because we were speaking about imperialism. Yes, this is true that the imperialism of the Russians today is not the imperialism of the Russians in the 19th century. Nobody believes that Putin is the representative of God on the earth. Nobody believes this. And the Russians do not believe anymore that Moskva Tretyi Rim, the church, should be the third Rome, should be the salvation for the whole world. They don't believe. So this is not the same empire than in the 19th century. But historians can see possible analogies. And the analogy is that in both cases, 19th century, 21st century, there is an idea of sovereignty when the head of the states has all the power. He should be very strong. He should have one language, one religion, and one narrative, a common history. This is the same mechanism of the 19th and the 21st century, but there is a big change. It's not the Christian religion which is in the center. It's a new pagan religion based on fatalism. When Putin started the war, he said, I had no other way. It was an obligation. If I would not decide to invade Ukraine, they would start the first. You know, there is the idea of fatalism, and you can heal this, but you need historians for that. Thank you.
Ein wunderbares Schlusswort. Das andere,
What a wonderful way to wind up here.
it rhymes. Also es gibt dann eben doch gewisse
So there are always certain continuations. I will not try to summarize what we have discussed here. We have not even tried to finish discussing this or that point. We wanted to look at the things from different angles for you to take home. So I think we overdid a little bit. We are outside our timetable, but you got more food for thought than you ever expected. I would have been kicked out if we were on TV here, but between historians you can say, well, what are 20 minutes in the view of the status of world history? Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the evening, and our hosts will wind up. Thank you. Come back home and come back again. A very brief concluding remark. Thank you, Mr. von Marschall, for moderating the evening. Thank you to our panelists, Mrs. Scherbakov, Mrs. Beck, Mr. Nowak, Mr. Ajakovsky. You have shared with us your views, your perspectives, the views in your countries, the background to things, and you shared with us your personal views and comments. We haven't reached the end of it all. We have not achieved a joint result, but we have seen that there's a lot to be discussed between our countries. There's still a great need to address things, and we are not yet there at all. We need to stand together. We need to show our solidarity also when debating issues with one another, because we want to strengthen the European idea. We may have different views, but we want to continue the debate, want to intensify it, and this is what we see as our most important task here in the European Network, Remembrance and Solidarity. This is the end of a long day. We are in the middle of our conference that will continue tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And the European Network, Remembrance and Solidarity, is firmly convinced that this kind of discussion is more urgent than ever, that it needs to be continued and intensified. We hope for your support. Watch what we do on the internet. We have a website that gives you an account of what we organize. Register for our newsletter, because we are also active in Warsaw, in Barcelona, in other places. So we have lots of activities that you might find interesting. Please stay with us. Thank you for your attention. Have a pleasant evening. Come back home safely and come back here again. Thank you.